On the satellite map near the Port of Los Angeles, you can see huge lots packed with neat rows of colorful rectangles. From above, they look like pieces from a construction set. But in reality, they're shipping containers, steel boxes that bring all kinds of cargo into the United States. And here in Los Angeles, they're just sitting there, waiting for someone to put something inside them, because that's basically what containers are for, carrying goods. Most of them arrive here from China, bringing in everything from electronics to, well, pretty much anything you can imagine. Tons of different products, right? The containers are unloaded right away. The goods are taken out and sent on further. And the containers themselves are just set aside. What else are they supposed to do with them, right? In January of this year alone, the ports of Los Angeles counted something like 710,000 of these empty containers just sitting there unused. Because what else would you do with them? And this isn't just one port's problem. Thousands of containers are piling up in many port cities, and nobody knows what to do with them. By the way, I should probably say a few words about the containers themselves, just in case some people don't know what they're actually for. At first, containers seem like something super distant, something ordinary people never really deal with in everyday life. To be honest, I don't even remember the last time I saw a single container in real life. But in fact, most of the world's trade happens by sea. Something like 80% of all goods have been shipped from somewhere to somewhere else by water. Just look around you right now. 4 out of every 5 things near you were almost certainly delivered by sea. And of course, for those goods to make it all the way across the ocean, the container has to be strong enough. That's why they're such heavy-duty structures. Just imagine you've got a steel box and they load, say, 66,000 pounds of cargo into it. They close the box, put another box on top of it, load another 44,000 pounds of cargo into that one, and they close it, grab the next one, and that's how they remain, stacked in huge piles on these massive container ships. And they're sailing across the ocean the whole time. And the containers are completely fine. Storm or no storm, it doesn't really matter, the container holds up, because from the very beginning, it was designed to get the cargo safely to the customer. And a container can be shipped back and forth across the ocean like that for 15 or 20 years, and nothing much will happen to it. Sounds great, right? But that's exactly what creates a massive problem. And this is where I realize we need to say a few words about where all these containers in U.S. ports even came from. I mean, they don't just respawn there to fill up space. So most shipping containers in the world are made in China. And I mean most, more than 90%. Why China? Because it's much easier to build containers in the same place where the goods are actually being shipped from. Most goods today are made in China, so naturally the containers are made there too. See how convenient that is? You build the container, make the product right there, load it into the container, and ship it out. In China, this is a highly developed industry. There are several major companies there, and they've managed to make containers so cheaply that even manufacturers in North America and Europe find it more profitable to buy them from China. Other countries make containers too, like Vietnam or India, but they're nowhere near China's scale. Of course, in a perfect world, the goods would be made in China, loaded into a Chinese container, and shipped to the U.S., and then in the U.S., they'd unload the goods, put American goods inside, and send the container back to China. But that's pure utopia. A world where all diseases have been defeated. Every dog and cat has a home, and containers, well, you get the idea. The problem is, that's not how it works. Far more goods come from China to the U.S. than from the U.S. to China. What a surprise, right? I even have some numbers here. In 2023, the U.S. bought $308 billion worth of goods from China, while selling only $106 billion worth of goods back. Feel the difference? So what happens is that most of the containers arriving from China in the U.S. end up sitting there empty. Of course, you can see it most clearly on the West Coast. Like I said, at the Port of Los Angeles, where goods from Asia flow in nonstop, and along with them comes a bonus, a massive pile of containers. It all adds up. And instead of looking like a normal port area, it starts to look like a giant pile of building blocks. Except that the blocks are enormous and rectangular, so not exactly blocks. I had ones like that as a kid. I remember them perfectly. But of course, the problem isn't limited to the West Coast. It exists in ports all across the U.S. Take the Port of Savannah, for example, in the state of Georgia. You know where that is? It's on the complete opposite side of the country. And yet, it's been reported that around 8,000 shipping containers are already sitting there. That's 50% more than what the Port of Savannah normally handles. They're just standing there, waiting for someone to do something with them. Either move them to warehouses or load them onto ships, basically waiting for anything to happen. Except nothing is happening. The warehouses are full, and as I already said, not that many ships are leaving the US, so the containers just keep sitting there, unwanted and useless. Poor little things. And the situation has become so absurd that even major ports are running out of space to store cargo. At this point, the only real way to fix it would be to rebuild the entire global maritime infrastructure. But, who's gonna do that? Exactly, nobody. So for now, ports don't really have another option. They can't just keep expanding simply to fit even more containers on their property. That's already absurd. Lately, I've been hearing a lot of news about U.S. ports getting seriously backed up. Constant bottlenecks, traffic jams, delays, all that stuff. And at first you might think, what do containers have to do with any of this, right? But it turns out they have a direct impact. Because when empty containers start piling up, they create problems for the containers that actually still have goods inside. Let me explain why. First of all, empty containers simply take up space in storage yards or in the port itself, and that space is limited. New containers with new goods are supposed to arrive there, but where are they supposed to go if everything's already packed? And it's not just that there's nowhere to put them, it also makes it much harder for workers to do their jobs, because just imagine your apartment. Would it be easier to move around and get things done if the whole place were filled with empty boxes, or if it were clear? I just remembered that my neighbors once had something like that. You open the door and it's just boxes stacked all the way up to the ceiling, with a little corridor in between them. So yeah, it's basically the same thing with warehouses and containers. But that's only the first problem. The second problem is that these containers don't move by themselves. They don't have wheels or anything, so to move containers around, you need a chassis. Not airplane landing gear, special container chassis, and of course there's only a limited number of them, but very often empty containers are just sitting on those chassis. Don't ask me why, I have no idea. So in the end, there's not enough chassis, not enough space. Basically, there's not enough of anything. Everyone's annoyed and nothing in the port works properly. And then the obvious question comes up. If all these containers came from China, why not just send them back there? Let the Chinese deal with them. But apparently, shipping empty containers is inefficient and insanely expensive. It costs a ton of money, requires a whole bunch of extra steps, and brings in zero profit. It seems super obvious when you think about it. Whether a container is full or empty, it still takes up the same amount of space on a ship. Sure, it weighs less when it's empty, but moving it still requires a lot of resources, from the container ship itself to the fuel, plus the people who handle the whole process, and those people have to be paid. So basically, whether the container is full or empty, it still eats up money either way. But even so, companies still have to ship empty containers out because they literally start running out of space at the port. So if you're lucky enough to spot a container ship, chances are that roughly 4 out of every 10 boxes on board will be empty. Fun little fact. And remember how I said most containers are made in China? So sending them back seems not only logical, but also, fair maybe? Except China doesn't really need those containers. They already have tons of them. Okay, fine. Let's say you can't send the container back to where it came from, but maybe you can use it locally, like melt it down or something. They're made of steel, so surely that steel can be reused somehow, especially now when we supposedly live in the age of recycling. Why not? But that creates another problem too, because the cost of melting down a container is higher than any money you could possibly make from it. I mean, sure, you'd get something for it, just not much. Why? Because a container isn't just some big metal box. In fact, it has a lot of different parts. So before you can recycle it, you have to take it apart, clean it, and basically make it reasonably safe for further use. For example, most containers have a thick wooden floor inside. That floor is constantly soaked with all kinds of chemicals, insect treatments, antifungal agents, things like that. Basically stuff that gets added inside along with the cargo. You can't really do without chemicals because the cargo spends several weeks crossing the ocean, and without protection, it could spoil 10 times over before it even arrives. Plus, the older the container is, the more harmful chemicals, oils, and all sorts of other lovely stuff you can find inside it, all the things that have been evaporating and soaking into it over the years while it was in use. And just as a reminder, a container is typically used for about 15 to 20 years, so yeah, a lot can build up in there, even heavy metals. So to dismantle and melt down a container in the States, you first have to clean it completely. That means a ton of inspections and removing the floor, then taking the container apart, disposing of whatever is toxic, processing whatever isn't toxic, and so on, and you still have to pay the workers. Those workers also need a bunch of safety gear, from masks to insurance. Plus, you need special areas where all that waste can be stored. Long story short, it's a huge hassle, and in the end, you barely get anything out of it. You just wear yourself out completely. But there are even stranger sides to this story. So look, we've got thousands of containers just sitting there in Los Angeles at the port, getting in everyone's way. Meanwhile, some random farmer somewhere inside the US can't get a container to ship his products, and he actually needs one. And it seems logical enough, right? You've got empty containers, so just give them to the farmers. They'll use them, load them up with produce, plug those containers back into the logistics chain, and everyone's happy. The ports free up, nature heals, the dollar stabilizes, but for some reason, ocean carriers didn't want to do that. Or rather, they used to do exactly that. They would take containers and send them inland across the US so farmers could use them there. But recently, some ocean carriers, not all of them to be fair, said they weren't going to do that anymore. You can all go to, well, you get the idea. That's basically what they said. Instead, the carriers decided they would send those empty containers back to Asia. And that decision really hit farmers hard because they'd gotten used to the idea that the containers would be available, that they'd be able to use them. And then suddenly they were told, sorry, goodbye, no containers for you, figure it out yourselves. As a result, some empty containers are now being sent back to Asia instead of being used locally. Why? Because something happened that made ocean carriers lose interest in farmers. They decided that dealing with Asia was more profitable after all. But what was it? Remember that whole coronavirus pandemic thing? Well, during that time, again, as you probably remember, people were basically losing their minds and buying up food and all kinds of goods like crazy. Remember the fights over toilet paper and pasta? Yeah. So naturally, the more goods people bought, the more China ramped up its shipments, because demand creates supply and all that. But that immediately caused a problem because there were a lot of goods and not enough containers. And since there weren't enough containers, shipping costs went up, deliveries got delayed, basically a whole chain of problems followed, including wildly inflated prices and some absolutely insane transportation costs. So the Chinese looked at all that and started very aggressively demanding their empty containers back. I mean, why should they just sit around in the US? So naturally, the containers were sent back to Asia and the farmers were left with pretty much nothing. Basically, in case anyone still doesn't get what the issue was, prices shot up, but it became much more profitable to send an empty container back to China than to take that same container and send it inland to some farmers so they could load it with potatoes. Okay, to be fair, that was only during the crisis. Obviously, that doesn't happen all the time. But there are also containers that are, well, kind of VIP. The ones nobody's ever going to throw away, hand over to some farmers, or strip for scrap metal. These are refrigerated containers. You know what those are? They're the ones used to transport things like fruit, vegetables, all kinds of other perishable goods, and medicine. Basically anything that needs special transport conditions gets loaded into these special containers and shipped thousands of miles in comfort. Essentially, each one is like a giant mobile fridge or freezer, depending on how it's set up. And thanks to those giant refrigerators being shipped back and forth across the ocean, we can eat things like fruits and vegetables out of season, or get food from the other side of the world that, without these containers, would have gone bad 10 times over and turned into mold or some kind of weird organic mush. Yeah. These containers, of course, have a lot going on inside. Electronics, insulation, control systems, humidity management. It's a pretty complex piece of equipment, not just a giant metal box like a regular container, and naturally that technology gets treated very differently. I mean, it's one thing when you have some metal thing you can just leave sitting in a port and wait until someone eventually picks it up. It's completely different when it's equipment. Containers like that don't just get abandoned because they need to be inspected, serviced, repaired, and kept in constant use. And this is where shipping companies say, yeah, absolutely, no problem. We'll gladly move that fridge wherever it needs to go. We'll even take it empty. No questions asked. Bring it on. So that's why they really are VIP containers, while regular containers keep sadly rusting away in warehouses. And while the US still doesn't know what to do with them, I have a suggestion. Why not turn the containers into reefs? No, seriously, this isn't even some random fantasy of mine. It's actually a working idea. So back in 2017, Cambodia's Navy teamed up with foreign experts, took 2 shipping containers and dropped them into the water off the coast. And not just because everyone was sick of those containers sitting on shore and getting on their nerves, there was an actual goal: to turn the containers into shelters for marine life, and ideally places where coral could grow. Basically, there used to be natural coral there, but because people were overfishing and completely neglecting the environment, all those corals eventually died off, so they had to create some kind of artificial reef to help the coral recover. Because coral can't just grow out of nowhere, it needs something to attach itself to. So that's exactly why they took the containers, drilled holes in them, kind of like little windows and doors, and dropped the whole thing about 200 feet apart, and pretty deep underwater too. And to make sure nobody stole the containers, they even anchored them to the seabed. So the coral could live, the fish could swim around, Nemo could get lost and then be found again, that kind of thing. And since it's already been done once, why not repeat it in the US? Only on a much bigger scale. Because, well, there are a lot of containers. Besides, the US has already done something similar, although not with containers, but with regular railroad cars. This happened in Atlanta, and basically it was part of some huge project. The idea was also to create reefs for marine life, restore balance in the ocean and all that. Basically, they did it so everyone would be happy, and also so they could finally put those retired railroad cars somewhere, because they'd been an eyesore for everyone. So in December 2023, they took those cars, removed all the chemicals and components from them. Basically, they scraped out anything harmful, then they washed them, prepared them for marine life, loaded them onto a barge, took them out to deeper water, and dumped them there. The idea is that over time, an artificial reef will form there, a pretty big reef actually, and in theory, the sea creatures should appreciate their new residential complex, but it's still too early to draw any conclusions. What's kind of cool though is that containers don't really need much human help to become reefs. You know, they actually fall off ships pretty often, right? I mean, the exact number's hard to know, of course, but thousands of these containers really do get lost in transit every year. Because of storms, for example, and honestly, who knows what kind of problems can come up at sea. It's the sea, so these containers either sink to the bottom or end up somewhere in shallow water, but either way, they're scattered all across the oceans. And if you look at them that way, they're not all that different from shipwrecks. Well, except for the fact that containers obviously weren't floating around on their own to begin with, but that's a minor detail. That's why containers can create little local reef communities around themselves, just like ships do. Have you ever seen underwater footage of the Titanic? There's already a whole crowd living there. Sea cucumbers, crabs, sponges, cold water corals, basically a full-on party. And sunken containers work the same way. For example, in February 2004, a container full of rubber tires fell off a ship traveling from San Francisco to Los Angeles. The route isn't really the important part here. The point is that wind and waves knocked the container off the ship and it sank. Then in 2011, 7 years later, researchers decided to take a look and see what was going on with that container, and they found that crabs and octopuses had actually grown pretty fond of it. Maybe they'd opened a deep-sea tire shop down there. What's interesting, by the way, is that the container itself was barely touched by corrosion. It basically just changed careers and became a rocky reef, and animals that needed somewhere to attach themselves, scallops, snails, that kind of thing, latched onto it and seemed to be doing just fine. The lack of corrosion was explained by the fact that the water was freezing cold and very low in oxygen, so overall the container wasn't really breaking down, it was just calmly lying there on the seafloor. So there you go. The thing is, scientists still don't know for sure whether that's good or bad because, well, overall, we don't know that much about what's really happening down there in the deep. Of course, there are other ways to use empty containers too. You don't have to sink them. For example, there's this thing called container farms and greenhouses. For urban farming, they're basically a must-have. You take a container, clean out all the nasty stuff, chemicals, dust, the wooden floor. Basically, all of that gets removed. Then you insulate it and line it so you can put in trays with plants or maybe some pots. And after that, all a container like this really needs is a flat surface, water, and electricity. Well, and soil, of course, nutrients, all that stuff. You can put a greenhouse like that pretty much anywhere, in a parking lot, behind a restaurant, or on some empty lot. Plus, shipping containers are sealed, so pests can't get inside, and as a bonus, you can stack them on top of each other. That way, you could build an entire skyscraper of cucumber greenhouses. Pretty cool. Or you don't have to try to cram plants inside, you can use containers as ready-made building blocks instead, and cram people inside. After all, people are already doing that. And now you're probably picturing some kind of slum, right? Yeah, forget that. So there's Stadium 974 in Qatar, which was built for the 2022 FIFA World Cup, and it was actually assembled from shipping containers and a modular steel structure. The result wasn't just a stadium, but a building that could be taken apart after the tournament and rebuilt somewhere else, or even turned into several smaller venues. When you play with Lego and get a little too carried away? But in general, containers really do work like giant construction blocks. You can bring them in, place them, connect them however you want, and then, if needed, take them apart again and move them somewhere else. Come on, little stadium, where to leave it? It speeds up construction, cuts costs. And you've seen construction sites, right? They create a crazy amount of mess, and with containers, there's much less waste. What's cool is that some of these containers had previously been used to transport building materials to the actual site. So you get it, right? First they helped bring in the materials, and then they became part of the building themselves. And obviously this doesn't only work with stadiums. The US probably doesn't need as many stadiums as the number of containers piling up there. But in Brooklyn, for example, someone built a house out of containers. They stacked them on top of each other, cut them at an angle, and ended up with these cool terraces. The owners wanted an unusual home, and they got one. At the same time, the port got rid of some extra containers, and everyone seems pretty happy. You owe me a like. See you later.